Tuesday, and we are back for another episode on the MSP initiative. My name is George Bardisi, and I am joined today by Troy Cheeseman. And no, he does not sell cheese. And also Dan Duffy. Troy, had joined us on the call today. So we're kind of just getting all of our housekeeping in order. Give us a kind of minute or two to let people cycle in, and we will get this show on the road. Thanks for joining us today. Well, we get started, guys. I mean, Troy, where are you based out of?
I'm up here in a suburb just outside of Toronto called Oakville, Ontario, in Canada.
All right, Canada. How's are you able to move around? Or are you still pretty locked into your place?
No, we're still, well, they're opening up a little bit, and Dan can provide, I don't know what it's like in his neighborhood, but the weekend was one of those challenging times on Saturday where it was really nice, and people were, convening and doing some of those things, but we're able to move around a little bit, but we're, there's still a long way to go.
You're not able to go outside just for a walk?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, but trust me, those paths got a lot of treads in them now, right? Everybody's taking the same route, walking the dog. The dogs love it. My dog is as fit as it's ever been. Like, it's unbelievable. Not me, but my dog for sure.
It must be because I'm not eating at restaurants all day long, but I'm down like 22 pounds since this whole thing started.
Wow. I'm not going to lie to you. I went in the other direction.
Yeah, other direction.
That just goes to show you how much restaurant food I was eating, I think.
Yeah. Well, you're a channel guy, right? So, it's living out of the suitcase and eating in those nice places.
100%. How about you, Dan? Where are you out of?
I'm just outside of Toronto, on the northern edge of Toronto, in a town called Markham. We're really just about the city on its northern end. Yeah, so we're not too far, probably 40 miles from Troy.
Cool. So you guys are relatively close to each other, it sounds like?
Yeah.
Got it.
Close enough that far enough away though that Dan can't reach me by throwing rocks and things like that. So it works out quite nicely.
Wow, that says a lot. Right.
No Dan for a long time.
It sounds like you two are tight, which is great. I mean, we always love to see that relationship builder out there. All right, well, let's get this show on the road. Let's talk about the current, let's just start with, because unfortunately, we're still kind of in this lockdown. It sounds like, most parts of the world. What's the outlook? What have you been hearing? How are people doing? What's the feel? What's the noise like?
Yeah, well, I tell you from a vendor side, right? And I think we get a lot of good feedback in some other forums as well. It's that blended view of optimism and caution all at the same time, right? Living through kind of what they're working on in the way of current clients and optimism. I'm starting to hear from a vendor side, a lot more optimism, and a lot more of plan for the other side, right? And obviously Dan can kind of speak to exactly from the direct MSP side, right, on the business side. But on our side, yeah, it's starting to really pick up. A lot of partners are starting to find that time to think of not just kind of the table stake type stuff and really getting that house in order on that side, but also, what the client is going to want to really focus on. And so us, as I'm sure we progress in this conversation and the opportunities we think that they're going to be presented there, it's starting to blend out really well for us.
Good. What about you, Dan? What's your outlook on the current state of the world?
It's getting better. It's going to lift a lot more in the summer. It's kind of hard to say, but people are really chomping to get back. Having said that, I have to guess if I would think that 20 to 40% of the people that are working at home are probably going to stay there. In some way, shape, or form. There's going to be a lot of excess office space. But in terms of the business, in terms of, business continuity, we're having a lot of customers say, I still have to do it because I always have to do my yearly test, if not more frequently. But they say, hey, I don't want to come in. So, we can escort them into our data center. So it's a little tentative there. So most of them have pushed it off to further in the fall. They still want to get it done, but they're all starting to think about how can I do this test in the same frequency I want to test, but do it remotely, as opposed to, having 3 to 5 people come in and, do the 3 to 4 day test. So they're looking at almost, because
Troy, question that came in: are you related to Adam Cheeseman?
Not that I know of.
All right, well, there you go. We got that right off the cuff. All right, so let's talk about the technology angle of this whole situation, right? Because forever, right? I think maybe it's just really good marketing, or maybe it's just, we've heard the same content for a long time as people in the technology industry. But like disaster recovery, to me, that's backup. To me, over the years, I've always heard disaster recovery, hey, backup that you verified. But it sounds like now that we've been through this, that's not exact. It doesn't have the same connotation, right? I'm missing something.
Yeah, and Dan lives and breathes this every day, but for my 2 cents on that side, I think, somebody was Rory Sanchez, when I had a conversation with him at True Digital, made this. Sorry, it was on a podcast. He made this comment, and it was, you got disaster recovery and backup as a service, and that industry is incredibly well vetted, right? And the technologies have emerged, and new players in the space, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of that good stuff has been well entrenched. But the opportunity is, and this is where Dan understands it, especially because of the fact that they have a really deep disaster recovery as a service business model, is what we call that redheaded stepson, which was all that planning that went into the execution that is backup and recovery and disaster recovery. So I think there's been a tremendous amount of conversation and evolution in that type of technology over the last 5 to 7 years, especially. I mean, look at all the guys, right? Like at Datto and all these guys, and how big they become and prominent. And,
huge. They're a staple, right? There's nobody arguing that, everybody has to have more than the external drive, or God forbid, still tape backup out there.
Yep.
Floppy disks. I mean,
floppy disks.
I
all dating ourselves now.
Yeah. I mean, I hope not. But I mean, listen. I mean, hey, I have my backup. I have something on site, because my box could blow up, smoke could come out of the back of it, or the building burns down, and now I'm shifting my machines, my critical machines, to some data center somewhere.
Yep.
I mean, that's clearly a strategy that everybody needs to have a handle on. I'm not arguing that at all.
Yep.
But I feel like that's only a very small piece of the story now that, the whole globe all at once was forced to live in their houses and not go outside for a while, right? So businesses had to very quickly, you want to use the words digital transformation, fine. You want to use the words, modernization, fine. But at the end of the day, my concern is that disaster recovery or continuity planning has a whole different element to it that I just don't think anyone really, maybe the larger organizations paid somebody to create a plan forever ago, and they maybe dusted it off after the fact. But, to me, I feel like technology is a mechanism to help deliver continuity, business continuity, but it's not, there's other components to it, right? So Dan, let me pick your brain. Let's stop for the technical for a second. We're gonna touch on that. When somebody comes to you and says, I want to make sure my business has a plan in the, in case of the worst possible situation, well, how does that business conversation start? I'm curious.
Well, first of all, they better not be confusing backup with a service as DR as a service.
Yeah.
They better get that distinction straight. But the other thing is, you touched upon it there. I mean, we have the technology, so we got to be a lot more nimble. The days of turning around and pulling out the binder that cost you $300,000 to have printed up and put on the shelf behind you from an accounting firm, and seeing if the first 6 people you're supposed to call on the list is still the same a year later, and it's beside the last 3 you paid for, like that, or the last 5 you paid for, those days are gone. You have to be nimble, and it has to kind of be doable and quick, and part of your technical recovery. I mean, there's the business recovery, disaster recovery, and technical recovery. You have to be a lot more nimble, and we can do it, right?
So I'm sure the industry maybe changes how people view this, right? Because if you're in public services like the police department, you got to look at things completely different than, a manufacturing plant or whatever it may be. So my question is, generally speaking, what are the first 3 or 4 business elements that people are worried about when they start this conversation? Not that like, hey, after 9/11, all of a sudden terrorism comes to mind, like we didn't think about it before then. Now, after pandemic world, it's all right. What happens if what happens if the second wave comes? But like generally speaking, if we don't have a major worldwide issue to concern ourselves with in normal time, I call it. What are the main 2 or 3 things that the people in charge actually care about?
So it's still, people are get tired of hearing about RTOs and RPOs, but you better know what they are and what you can do there. But I think the other thing is the recoverability of your backups. And whether your backups are in the cloud or to disk or to tape or VTL or whatever it is, you better know if you can actually get them back up. And the thing always lurking there now is ransomware, malicious attacks, malware, etc. So people are getting very paranoid about that. So, realistically, are my RTOs and my RPOs, given the fact this stuff is lurking out there, can I do them? When's the last time I test them? What's the worst case I could be out? That's really top of mind.
Okay, so downtime is number 1 on the chart, right? Hey, how long will it take me in the event of the worst case scenario? Do my people get back to functional? So that's important. That's number 1. Troy, after that part, there's a lot of other components, right? There's, where my people are going to work from. There's staffing rotations. There's, security is probably a big topic these days. What's number 2 in your mind?
Well, it's a close, and again, when we talk about continuity, right, I definitely want to go beyond, even when we talk to a lot of partners, and Dan's heard me with this spiel, right? We say, think beyond DR, right? That's the first thing you got to do is think beyond DR if you're going to talk continuity with a business, right? Because the backup and the disaster recovery, you may provide that as a service, but when you talk continuity with a business, there are probably applications that you as an MSP, you don't support. Right? But the client has to consider those in the event their entire company gets whacked with ransomware, right? How do they communicate and organize and do all those different types of things? So I think that, as Dan has highlighted, and as we're kind of talking around a little tiny bit, that's the disaster recovery side when you talk business continuity is one sliver in that, when you're organizing and trying to plan that whole event. So on that train of thought, what we're hearing a lot is when partners and clients first come into the system, they do think DR, right? They come in and they think, okay, yeah, I can automate my DR plan, push the button, everything, everybody's communicated with, really cool and all that stuff. But then they see things like a ransomware attack plan, right? Or data breach response is becoming incredibly popular, right? So, because a data breach response, you don't respond properly, or you actually have a data breach, you don't follow the rules on how you're supposed to organize putting all that information together, it could put you out of business. Like the same way you could have an entire data center fail. It's almost equivalent. So I think in a way of detrimental impact to the business. So this is for us, what we're hearing a lot is where we do a lot of demos with clients on those automated type scenarios, is ransomware attack and data breach response is becoming a very, very big, very popular one.
Okay. Dan, have you, let's piggyback off that. Ever had to deal with somebody who just, had a ransomware attack? What does that look like?
It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare. We're in the lucky position that we can scramble the fighter jets. And what I mean by that is put 8 to 10 kind of heavy technical people on 24/7, 365. And we've had to do it a few times for customers. Now, the other part is sometimes they're contracted customers, sometimes they're just really customers in other parts of the business. And you kind of throw everything aside and, everybody does their best, but it's extremely taxing on the customer. It's extremely taxing on us. People get burnout and they get burnt out fast. And you end up, the more burned out you are further into the process, the more likely you're more likely you are to make a mistake in your restore and that sort of thing. So it's tough stuff. And the thing we've been telling people is your best risk mitigation is as frequently as possible, verifying the recoverability of your backups. I'm not here to give a pitch for anybody, but it comes down to it. I mean, maybe if you have $2 million a month to spend on this stuff and looking at anomalies of who might be coming into your system and all that sort of thing, but most customers don't have that. So the frequency that you can test the backups, but it's a nightmare when it's happened. We've supported 5 in the last 18 months, and they're brutal. They're brutal on everybody.
So how long does it take generally to come back from that?
I'd say it's kind of, well, again, it's not a big sample size, but 3 to 5 days of 22-hour days, and then probably another 3-ish after that, depending on, the customer sometimes gets to the point where they say, okay, we're limping along. Those others will recover later. They were non-critical, but you're looking at the better part of a week, and it's tough.
Yeah. Ever paid the ransom?
I know some people have paid the ransom. In the 5 that we've done in the last 18 months, the customers have not divulged that. It's one thing they really keep close to the vest, and we don't pry. So I'd say kind of 20 to 40% are paid, but no one says anything. But again, up to the individual company.
Troy, have you ever heard of the job of a ransomware negotiator before?
You know what? It was brought up on a call a while ago, but it's interesting that from even from a legal perspective is probably becoming something that's very, very popular. I would think.
On that note, George, on the ransomware negotiator, there's another term you're going to start to hear more and more often. It's called a breach coach. I've come across that, but it's usually a lawyer, and they're usually very specialized. So keep tuned on that one, because it seems to be a developing niche. And they do a number of things during a breach, but it's becoming a very, very sophisticated, expensive niche at some law firms. Breach coach.
I think that's probably why we're seeing such interest in that automated plan for clients, to be quite honest, because we've been fortunate that we've met with like a financial executive forum as an example, and it was such a focus on that, especially around privacy laws and et cetera. And the coaching, like all through that plan, there are points where it says, okay, consult your internal counsel and determine, do you need an external counsel? All those different types of things. And in a chaotic world, right, where it's, oh my God, this has happened, unless it's really, really organized or like coaching on that side, it could go south very, very quickly, right? And so that's interesting that it's, these types of professions are kind of bouncing up, and it's really boiling down to how quickly and not just how quickly, but how organized you are in response to these types of events, ultimately determine your success, whether you go out of business or whether you recover quickly or, you minimize your financial impact. So
sure,
that, I think, George, this is where when you were saying that this kind of renewed emphasis holistically on planning on a whole, whether it's backup, whether it's data breach, whether it's ransomware, testing, and as Dan, you highlighted, right? Testing those scenarios. That is, I think, post-COVID. And maybe there was this type of interest spike after like a dramatic event like 9/11 as well. That is where I think there's a lot of driving that's happening now, and that focus on planning.
It's interesting to that point. So Keith's on the call. He kind of throws a couple of thoughts into the mix, which I think are timely. Yeah, technology's great, but at the end of the day, in the big picture, right? Focus on the communication and the protocol, and like what happens within the first 24 hours of the event, right? Whatever that is. So I'd like to get your opinions on, because I'm going to be honest with you, depending on the size of the organization, they really haven't thought about this, conversation, to be honest with you. Yeah, they're worried that their business doesn't stay down forever. There's not necessarily a very well thought out plan here.
No, and Dan, I'll let you answer, but just because it's a stat that pops in my head, but just to kind of hit home that point, George, is that 36 million small businesses, if we want to generally categorize that in North America, and the stat leading into COVID was over almost 75% of them had nothing, no written DR plan, no business continuity plan, nothing. Forget testing those scenarios.
I'm
They
sure.
had
I'm
nothing.
sure
Right?
every single one of them checked that box off on the insurance policy saying they did.
Well, and yeah, and here, so we'll dive into that. I think a little bit around thought process around cybersecurity insurance, right? How these organizations are explicitly asking now for those plans. But just on that final stat of the 70%, what's really staggering about, if you think about that, is that that's 25 million plus businesses that literally, when COVID hit, and I know this is the obvious example, when they hit, I guarantee you what happened. They just called the MSP. And Dan, I think we talked about this in roles and responsibilities, even in some of those ransomware attacks in one of our meetings when we met previously, is they call you, the MSP, and go, oh my God, this just happened.
Yep.
Please help me do everything. And you're going, look, I'm not your counsel. I'm not this and that. So that lack of planning really shines through. And yeah, so that was just kind of the stat on that side that I found pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to tell you, and Dan, I'd love to hear your opinion, but I think generally speaking, and again, I don't know what the magic number is. Is it, if you're under 100 employees, you never thought about it, or like I would think every company needs to have an idea of what's going to happen when something bad occurs. But at the end of the day, I would love to understand. Even just on the communication standpoint, how do you get all of your people on the same page when everything is just on fire?
Well, I was going to say, a big part of it is, while you're scrambling trying to get the systems back up, it's like, who are you communicating with? When did you communicate? Because if you hang on too long and don't tell people, you're in big trouble. Did you tell the authorities? Are you obligated to tell, the police, the local police, the whatever, the FBI, whoever it is? I'm sorry, I didn't really answer your question.
It's okay. You're giving me raw thought. That's not bad.
Sorry, could you repeat your question again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, like, so we're going back to Keith's point, which is communication, first 24, maybe let's call it first day or two after something hits, right? Like, yeah, we can talk about ransomware and security, but I don't think anyone had a COVID pandemic plan. I'll tell you that. So like, I think to a large degree, communication is this Achilles heel, right? Because, like, how do you make sure that your people know what's going on and what is the talk track or what is the game plan and how do you even get that to them? Is it just send an email? I mean,
no, it's definitely not just send an email. It's early, first of all, it's got to be early and often, and air towards often or being out there too much, but it's email, it's text, it's, however you can get to them. And the good news is there's technology around where you can script a lot more of these scenarios. So at least maybe, one off the top of your head and you're pretty good at it, but the other three, you go, bing, here's some steps to follow. And it doesn't necessarily have to be you. If you're not there, someone else can step into your shoes. And it all sounds great. And back to your point about who needs it. And again, technology is on our side. I would say if you're under 1,000 employees or under $1 billion in sales, you got to get a little better.
Yeah, well, that's that, and that's right. Like you think about.
I would say the billions are more, call it 500 million and down mostly, but it's a lot of people have billion. I'm sure on this call $1 billion customers, but under $1 billion and under 1,000 employees, you better have some semblance of this ready, or you're going to get.
You'll be out of business.
Flapped.
So like, give me an idea. What is an actual, like a legit continuity plan consist of? I must not even be thinking of all the aspects, right? I'm just going through like, hey, if you can't come to the building, if the system's inaccessible, do we go to paper and pencil? Like, I'd love to understand just the building blocks. What should be in that?
Troy, I'll let you handle that.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess there's obviously an entire framework, right, around business continuity planning. I think one of the complexities, and George, as you ask the question, you automatically start thinking of all these different scenarios, right, that could impact a business, and it's become so complex these days. If we go back, like Dan, when you first started your business, go back 30 years ago, right, and if you were to put together a DR plan or a continuity plan for a client. Let's put the complexity aside for a second. It looks so differently today. Like you don't talk ransomware, you don't talk all those things. So let's just kind of understand that. But I think the beginning of any continuity plan is just to simplify the approach. and think in scenarios, right? So depending on the size of the business, itemize your scenarios, right? And what does that mean? Okay, well, if I'm an MSP and I'm approaching a business and you know, they ask me because a lot of clients go, I don't even know where to start. Let me go to my trusted advisor, right? Let me go to my source, my MSP. And they go, hey, can you create me a DRR plan or a continuity plan? Depending on the size of the business, you start thinking in scenarios. Start off with 5, right? What are those 5 scenarios? You always have the classic, like a fire plan, ransomware attack plan, data breach, depending on the industry they're in. We even, you know, there are business continuity plans now, like active shooter events. So again, that whole underlying theme of think beyond DR, but itemize those scenarios, and then that gives you almost the entire basis of what your continuity plan is going to look like, right? Because, and you can find scenarios. We obviously, you know, Cloud Oak and with our partnership and Dan, of course, we have an automated system that takes care of this whole thing. But, you know, you start thinking of those scenarios, and once you build out those scenarios, then that really will be the building blocks of your entire continuity plan. And then you play those scenarios as, you know, either test them or as they play out. Oh, we got hit with ransomware. Run scenario 1. Okay, 2, good. So it's like you're almost establishing that playbook in context of the different types of scenarios that exist. I think the industry challenge with that is the business, depending on their size, unless do have a lot of maturity, they can't think of those scenarios, right? They'll think of a backup, a DR, because MSPs have told them about that. And of course they know about ransomware, right? But when you kind of go beyond that, you know, it's something that the opportunity for the managed service providers to get them to think about those scenarios.
Okay, so scenario: building burns down, tornado.
A simple. How about
those are the regular ones?
The regular ones. Yeah,
those are the regular ones.
But like a very simple scenario, right? How about it's just the denial of access to the building for a day?
Yep.
Okay, power's gone out. Something really simple. You know, when we talk and get in these contexts, you know, we say, you know, you could have a full-fledged continuity event. Your infrastructure is just fine, man. Everything is running.
Mm-hmm.
COVID, of course, puts the massive stamp on that whole thing. In that the entire world is remote and your servers are all running fine, but it's a really, really big continuity event to get everybody out. And there's a really, really, really big continuity event going to happen and getting everybody to come back in a staggered approach. And how do you do all that? So there's a lot of work in doing it. If you're to do it as part of a classic ecosystem, right, of manually creating the plans, you know, working on that with your clients and trying to think through those scenarios. And it explains a lot why 70% of an entire, you know, community of businesses, you know, they spend more time planning their vacation than they do the continuity of their event, right? Because of all that complexity that's there.
So if the idea here is that every business should have a continuity plan if they don't have one, then Dan, how many customers called you and said, hey, I need to kick off my continuity plan? Like, that's a lot of people pointing their arrows all at once.
You know what? We didn't have anyone declare because specifically of COVID, but ransomware seem to be spread out, thank God. But you know, if you have multiples, you know, you handle that either you're on a first come first served basis, or if you have dedicated equipment with us, it's a different thing. You can have different flavors there. But you would make the point earlier that people at least have to have get better at doing this than they have been. Because the two things that come in, and you mentioned one of them, like if you have cyber insurance, first of all, if you have cyber insurance, it should be tailored to your business. So if you have you're an MSP, your cyber insurance is going to be different than your end user, generally speaking. But you want to show that you've done your due diligence or at least had your act together as well as your peer group, if not better, because two things will happen. One, cyber insurance companies will pay off like they're supposed to. And the other thing is you get rid of lawyers faster. So what happens on the other side is and especially now with we've seen this everywhere, US, Canada, all around the world, the integrated supply chain. Well, you didn't have your act together and you went down and you affected my supply chain. And if you can stand up and say, no, I test 2 to 4 times a year or whatever the frequency is, you know, the industry standard is 1, come load your tapes, get a check mark a year. I do, 4 times better than that. They tend to go away because you can say, hey, no, I do better than my peers. So again, not everybody can do it, and and people's whole lives can't be DR planning and testing. They have businesses to run. We get that, but again, with the advent of technology, at least you can say, we executed these scenarios once or twice or 3 or 4 times a year, and you're way ahead of the curve.
Yeah,
our friend Keith comes back. He throws a couple more ideas into the mix. He says, optics, internal and external, right?
Yep.
It's almost like having a PR plan to some degree, ready to go, right? Messaging's key, right? So he brings up the scenario of an active shooter event, right? What happens when the authorities are brought in and they shut access off to your building for a while because they have to do an investigation? So now you're cut off from your building. Your employees need to be, number one, it's like a mental, thoughts, mental state situation, right? You need to make sure that they're in a good place, right? Before you can put them back into, working mode, right? So, I think to some degree, what's interesting is, as technology people, right, as people who are servicing end users, trying to help them figure out how to make all of the automated wheels spin, we tend to not even be in a situation to know all of these things, right? We may need to partner with other people who are good at these things. Like, I can give you my idea on what a PR plan would look like, but I surely, that's not something I do every day.
No, you're 100% correct. And some people have internal PR departments and all that. I mean, most of us don't. Let's be serious. But even if you have some scripts prepared and that's part of your plan, or it's a separate execution plan, you're ahead of the curve. And you're right. And we've had it where people, couldn't get back into their buildings due to flood. The stuff was all fine, but they couldn't. So they came here and recovered. Now that's a little different thing. But what some people are looking at is having a separate site that they can just, if their people are caught out of the building and can't get back into it, that they can at least go to, and they can fire up 10, 20 laptops, whatever, to keep the IT staff going. And again, it varies on size. So we have had that request too, which we're working on. But yeah, the PR, I don't know. The more script you have, the better. Come out early and often. You know what? And I will tell you though, people do give people a break if you tell them the truth and you tell them early, because they feel for you. That's the only silver lining in ransomware recovery. People give you a break because they think they have some empathy about the horror show you're going through. So you do get a bit of a break, but communicate.
Yeah, I don't disagree. Honest communication. I mean, listen, if you lie, at some point it's going to come back and get you. I think we've all learned this, right? Yeah. Or have seen it, or have watched a movie on it. It never stays secret. That being said, I mean, it's an interesting time, right? I mean, we had Brad Gross, who's an attorney, on a few times earlier in the series, and he was saying, if you haven't looked at your master services agreement in the last 3 years, you ought to, refresh it now. How often is the disaster or business continuity plan refreshed?
In today's environment, probably the last time it left the printer when it was made, to be quite honest. That dynamic is obviously, we feel that we can change that, but that's the truth. I mean, the analogy of, we were on a call with a partner and it was the best. He kind of reached behind, right, and grabbed, as I'm talking, and he reached behind and grabbed a binder, and he goes, "See this, Troy?" He said, "This is a business continuity plan that a client wanted created. The only option we had was to get a consultant. It was $15,000. I got this 3-ring binder." And away we go. Yeah, like it's very expensive. And, he takes the dust off it. And he said, and you know what? The client came back 6 months later, had to do some updates, because when you look at continuity plans, it's not just about the scenarios, but you got to know who to call, what's called a call tree. There's what's called a roll call element in there, blah, 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 blah. This entire framework that exists around it. He said, so I called the consultant back in, and it was going to be another $10,000 to update the plan. And if you think of that, like, think of how many small businesses and medium enterprise, well, maybe medium enterprise, but small businesses, like that's out of reach.
I mean, we're buying cars with this money here. It's a lot of cash. I'm hiring people with this money.
And we all know it's the classic thing in I mean, the price tag, the manual nature of it, et cetera. And then when something does happen, like, nobody's reaching in to grab, if they did go down this road, they're not grabbing the binder out. Right, of their.
What if the binder went up with the building that you can't get into?
right? And then, some people may argue, well, you put it on SharePoint, you do all that stuff. It's the ecosystem. If it's manual, I mean, this is why small businesses, they wear many hats and things like that, that at least post pre-COVID, if I could call it that, there was just no focus on it, right? There was just no focus on it holistically.
Yeah, I'm just thinking out loud, right? Using COVID as the obvious example because we're all living it still. I'm not sure how many people had 30 laptops ready to go. I mean, I swear I heard people tell business owners didn't even contact the IT department or MSP. They said, "Hey, take the computer from underneath your desk and take it home." I mean, that's a nightmare to begin with, right? Because but there was no plan. There is no plan. There still isn't a plan.
No.
And some people may never have a company to come back to have a plan, right? I mean, we still don't know what the aftermath looks like. So, so it sounds like the plan should be updated more than the last time there was a major incident, right? I mean, that's number one.
Or the last time it was printed, yeah.
Number two, IT is only part of the plan. It sounds like there's other components. Another one from our friend Keith, who, full of knowledge. I love this guy. He's like, listen, media, right? I had, when we have to get, involved with, the news networks like the CNNs, the MSNBCs, I'll even throw Fox in there just to keep it fair and balanced. Multiple times, they have an agenda when they're reporting stuff versus the reality, right? And now you're trying to make sure that there's once again an optics thing depending on your situation and how much notoriety you have, right? I mean, we're all hearing about supply chain now in North America, right? Whether it's the meat plants or dairy, food, and we're hoping everybody's toilet paper finally comes to full stockage somewhere. I never thought of having a toilet paper recovery plan because you just can't get it. But I mean, at the end of the day,
we're gonna put that one in the system.
Hey, you should add the module, right?
We'll call it the George B plan.
Hey, it's an important topic. So on the technology aspect, right? I mean, not everybody's backing up their desktops. I know a lot of people have adopted terminal services. I know a lot of people have adopted, the cloud services, right? Just Dropbox or OneDrive, and then just web-based apps. I know a lot of people have adopted virtual desktop, right? Where the machine that you're running on doesn't matter. You can log in from anywhere. It just, but that's like one aspect, right? There's always peripherals. There's always all these other gadgets that you forget about. I mean, coming back to your point then earlier where you're like, hey, I think 20 to 40% of the people that are home now don't go back. That's a high number from what a lot of people have been guessing. How often do people stock their people at home to be able to work like this? I mean, I know webcams are almost impossible to get now, but given the current situation, when you're talking technology from a continuity standpoint, what's the bare minimum now at this point today?
Well, the answer to your question is never. Okay, and we all found out the hard way this time. I mean, unless you're already established working at home. There's a lot of people that weren't. By the way, my 20 to 40% comment was the 20 to 40% who are working at home. I think 20, 40% of those people will not come back. Yeah. There's going to be a lot of excess office space. But, I don't know, maybe get some sort of simplified form and you do it at triage and say, we've got 100 people in our company. There's 25 to have it. Maybe you have those laptops ready to go with your golden image somewhere with some security software on them. You test them every quarter and you sit them somewhere that you can get to. And take care of those 25 people first. I don't know. I'm just picking stuff out of the air, but nobody's really that prepared, and everybody had to scramble. I think part of it is, could they get in okay? Could they get on a properly configured VPN? All that sort of stuff. What's the security like? What's the Wi-Fi security like at home, which is a big one. So
yeah.
I think people will dip their toe in, but again, it'll be interesting because people forget. Right. And if this is all over, call it September 2021, go, yeah, I was thinking of having a spare one at home, but times 100, I don't know. So we'll see. It'll be interesting.
What'll be interesting coming out of all that on that theme and just preparedness, and because George, right? The balance between an MSP is you don't want stock, and you guys, Dan, as well, you don't want stock sitting on your shelf, right? Because it's not generating money, and there's entire peer groups that are around, your balance sheet and all that other stuff, which is very valid, by the way. But what's interesting about how that workforce is now going to behave, and will companies forget, is that will compliance type drivers, will they now, because that pendulum started to swing, if you look at things like HIPAA, because there's been a couple of conversation points on that theme of forgetting, hey, the HIPAA, everybody understands through this COVID thing that there's some elements that maybe they're just looking over here right now. They're not looking exactly at it. That's not staying there. Right. And we know that. And more of these compliance drivers are going to be a factor in this decisioning. The event itself is creating an emphasis on planning, right? And all the different nuances of planning that goes with it, whether it's disaster recovery, whether it's things, scenarios like ransomware, et cetera, remote workforce, how do they come back, checklists, all this stuff is going to be there. But what's going to be really interesting is how compliance and these types of drivers, and now these, like for the US as example, state-based data privacy laws are coming in, how they will now be modified to now start to incorporate, okay, now you got all these people working from home, and we had an event like COVID, and what does all that mean? What does it all mean, especially to proper planning? And I'll highlight one example. It was in New York State that the financial regulatory body there asked every financial institution, show me your health pandemic plan. They out and out ask them, show me the plan, show me you've been testing it. So I think there's going to be a lot of driver and change as we come out the other side of COVID, a lot of opportunity. But I also think that there's going to be a compliance driver is going to be a big concern. And I'm sure all the security guys out there who are far more knowledgeable than I am on all this stuff, they're starting to think in that context as well, because, everybody's sitting at home, right?
Interesting that you say that, right? I mean, not to get political, trust me. Keith's plenty political for all of us. Thanks, Keith, by the way, for all your comments. And he's a Cowboys fan too. That just puts it over the top. I mean, we hear about the concept of stockpiling, right? I mean, you hear about the states and the feds and how much of this stuff was supposed to be kind of ready to go in the event, and nobody had it. It comes back to kind of some of the stuff we've been talking about, Dan. Where hey, how many laptops are you going to have ready to go in the closet for how long, right? Or Troy, you said, hey, you got to run out and figure it out in the moment, as much as possible. But, I think there's a newfound concept of, hey, especially when travel is, I know they said they didn't shut down travel for commerce, but when we're talking about supply chain, even technology supply chain, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I can tell you right now, I know people have put orders for equipment in 60 days ago. They have no idea when it's going to show up.
I can tell you about a major manufacturer that 2 months ago told me that they had 50% of their workforce back in Wuhan, but they were only getting 15% of the production off the line, on parts to complete it. And so I have a prediction for you, George. I think people will be as prepared with excess gear for work at home on a percentage basis as there will be a percentage uptick in ventilators available as a percentage over what they were prior to the pandemic.
I mean, they're building, you just look at the news. They've GM and all these companies are building ventilators. I mean, I'm going to tell you, a lot of the manufacturing is not happening here. We know this. It's no secret. And it's got to come over on boats and planes. And I'm curious to see how far backed up all of that really comes in, just from a general, thought. But, there's no question that as technologists, number one, there needs to be a discussion with the downstream end customer about, hey, let's start talking about the most realistic scenarios, right? Like Troy said, that's number one. I don't think that conversation is happening, honestly, or if it is, it's not happening often. And then number two, from the IT sliver of that plan, because it's really part of it. I get it, but it's not all of it, as we talked about. Like, where do we fit? When do we fit? And then, the kind of thought that's now at the very, very top of my head is throughput. How IT and technology firms are profitable is like a one-to-many, right? Like, they're not staffing a person in every single customer's location for that scenario. And like when all of that water starts coming down the water main at full blast, That is a lot of stuff to chew on in a small period of time. Like, I get everybody kind of experienced that with this, like all of a sudden, like 300% requests of help, their help desk volume went up, and then it finally kind of came back down. But like, I've never gone as far to think about, most technology providers are regionally based, right? I mean, if their entire region is shut down for anything, that's a lot of things to worry about that now pop up all at one time. I'm really curious about how these people can handle throughput. Dan, can you give us an idea? Like, what was your worst scenario? And like, you're talking about 22, 23-hour days. I mean, what if everybody gets ransomware at once? Or what if an entire, like, county or region gets shut down? I mean, I haven't even thought about these things.
No one's prepared for that. Not even close. Not even close. Because you get overwhelmed. It's interesting that our regular MSP, and I don't know what other people on the call are experiencing, but our regular business, our tickets have actually gone down during this quite a bit. I assume that's what people are experiencing.
Eventually, right? Maybe not in the beginning, but eventually they did.
But the spike, and then
you know what? If it was a multiple thing, like statewide, region-wide, a couple of countries side by side, like Canada and the U.S., I don't know. It'd be a nightmare.
I mean, it sounds like there's a lot. I mean, to a large degree, there's you got to have your relationships lined up, right?
Yep.
I mean, that's really what it comes down to. Yep. If you're not really confident in the people that's, the vendors and the other, even maybe partnering with other people that are in your region, if you don't have that in place, you may already be too late by the time that happens.
Yep. And I can give you a perfect scenario of that too, is we had a customer come to us, and a good customer. We don't like to do this. And it was after we started sending people home to work at home, and they said, hey, can we just bring 5 people in to print off statements? Can we just come into your building, because we had, tons of comm and all the rest of that, and lots of seats and all the rest of stuff. The answer was twofold. The answer was no, because A, we don't enter into contracts with people experiencing disasters, and they consider disaster. It's not fair to the people who've been paying us for disaster recovery all along, right? That's number one. Number two, it's, I had a bunch of people going, wait a minute, we're going to meet them at the door. And they only wanted 5 people. 5 people, put them in a back room. We got lots of rooms, blah, blah, blah. Okay, we're going to take their temperature every day. We're going to have them wash their hands. Are we going to wipe the doors they come in and out of? We're going to babysit. How are we going to get food in and out? That was just 5 people. And, unfortunately, and they didn't like it. We had to turn them down for the sake of our people who were still here, even though we had a skeleton staff. So it's a tough scenario.
I mean, yeah, it's a 100-year thing, right? I mean, we weren't around when the last one hit. I don't think anyone, listen, there's been little things, right? Zika and swine flu and all this other stuff, but I don't, even just regular flu, I don't think, hey, he had a flu, he went home. All right, well, get better. Yeah. So as MSPs, as IT service providers, so there's now we've all been this whole call, we've been circling around business continuity planning as a service. Man, that's a mouthful. I had to say it really slow. Business continuity as a service. I don't think anyone's thought about this as a thing to do, as another thing to add into the business consulting part of what we do. I surely know that I don't think anyone thought about making this something that they charge for either. Troy, this is kind of what your company does a little bit. So like,
yep.
give us a picture. Like for the people on the call, the people who watch this afterwards, like put the whole thing out there on the table. Why is this something they should actually start concentrating on?
Yeah, and Dan is obviously a partner of ours, and he'll be able to speak to kind of the practicality and use of it and things like that. But when you looked, all the things we've talked about in the way of scenarios and things really dealt with 2 points. One, the massive complexity that goes in all the different things that are considered in what is previous to our product, a manual ecosystem, right? So if I wanted to create plans today, any of those scenarios we talked about, and if I'm the client or I'm even a partner for my own business, it takes a long time. I got to go find the template. I got to think about the scenarios. I got to do all that stuff. And then forget the fact that the event actually happened, right? Like, so if something happens, I'm not grabbing the paper document. Now I got to manually, if you think of a small business today, if they got to manually coordinate the whole event, a small business and medium enterprise today, A lot of them are using fractional services. So an MSP, right? An accounting service, maybe some fractional HR services. So think in a manual world, how you got to coordinate everybody through an event, right? That's why a lot of MSPs, when an event happens for a business, what ends up happening is the client calls them and just goes, please help. And it's almost like they're so overwhelmed with it. And then in the end, trying to remember who did what, where were we successful, where did we fail? So as a leading up to COVID, if you wanted to enter that business, that entire manual ecosystem, many partners, maybe they were doing DR plans, but many of them went, forget it. Like it's a billable time thing only. I got to have a high degree of expertise. How do I enter this space? And again, I mean, we spent 50 minutes talking about all these different scenarios and complexities that went with it. So we've basically automated that entire ecosystem. And I borrow a quote from Dan in all my presentations now, and it's basically business continuity planning at the push of a button. And I think it's the best way to describe it. So now for small business, and if you're servicing those clients and things got to be cost effective, et cetera, it's literally all those kind of major complexities in that manual ecosystem. It's all very simple, very push button, all cloud based. And that ranges from things, as Keith even highlighted, very extreme events like active shooter, all the way down to organizing data breach response, to ransomware attack, to something as a classic plan like a fire evacuation plan. So we specifically brought that to market. And Dan, who I've done some previous work with before in his MSP business, has a very mature disaster recovery as a service and disaster recovery product offering. So it was a very natural fit for us to say, hey, Dan, look at this, the kind of redheaded stepson of the industry there, backup, disaster recovery planning and business continuity planning. What do you think? And it's been a great start in that partnership, because especially the way that they've incorporated it into their stack and what they plan to do to go to market. So with that, I'll do the the Brady Bunch look this way and hand it over to Dan. So Dan, maybe you can talk about how your approach and your go to market and stuff.
Yeah, and I would say business continuity as a service. Yeah, that's a great phrase. I mean, you still do have to do work, and your customer has to do work, but you can do it much more if and I don't want to just say do it yourself, but the customer can do most of this, and it's a nice. So you're taking advantage of the automation, but you don't need the $50,000 consultant and the dusty book behind you. And I'm not trying to slam anybody who does that kind of thing for a living, because it may be much more thorough in certain situations. But
larger companies for sure.
Yeah, but you can also, as an MSP, you can also offer kind of bundled in with your product as if you want to. I mean, the price point is great to do that, and also it creates a little more two-way, glue with your customer. It's like, I know you guys are doing it, but if you want our input, you want to talk to the tech team and say, okay, look, I like all this, but since we moved to more of a hybrid environment, and I've got some in Azure and I've got some on-prem at my place and some, replicated to your place, Dan, and blah, 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 blah. Could get the guys for a conference call to talk about, what we should do and what technical recovery plans we should attach to each one of those if we had to recover them together or individually or whatever, right? And oh, by the way, how do we handle those the ones with no source code where the vendor's gone bad, where we kind of tiptoe by those white boxes? How do we handle those ones, right? That's a little different. That's a little different one, right? But you can do it. So it's here, but you still have to do work, but it's a lot more accessible.
Do you is this part of who do you assign this to in your organization, and what do you charge? Where do you figure out where to charge for a service like that?
Where to charge is a little tricky at this point, because customers will say, oh, you just come install it for us, and we'll say we'll walk through it, we'll show you the demo, we'll do all that sort of stuff. It's at a price point where you're going to buy it or not. I mean, either you believe that there's value there, and it's certainly so far so good. And we'll help people do an install. If they want us to say, look, I could do this, but I can't clone myself. Could you come in and help us? Great. If they have a point person, we'll come and say, book a day or two for, whatever, X thousands of dollars a day, blah, blah, blah. We'll come in almost like a mini two-day project. Okay, who are we handing off to? Who are we checking to? So there would be some services drag to it for sure. Not huge. This isn't that we have a JD Edwards ERP practice. It's not like that kind of service drag. But it's there. Some people just go, thanks, got it. Can't believe you're selling it for this price. See you later. I may come back for some more when I think of other ways to use it. And I'm not just a plug for Troy, but Yeah, it's being embraced because, again, whether 50 people, 100 people, or a billion people, someone's going to ask them, "Did you do this stuff?" Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so is this a continual service that you're offering, or is it more of a project service?
Uh, Again, small numbers at this point, but either or, we'll go either way. If the customer says, "Do you want us to do a monthly tweak to it, or do something, or have a few hours a month where we review things, or quarterly, or whatever?" Yeah, we do it on a quarterly basis or a monthly basis, or they don't want to be doing as much as I keep talking about frequency. They don't want to be doing this every week, right? So if you can, if we get them off the launch pad and they're fine on their own, great. But if they want to check in every once in a while, great too. Or if they say to us, "We're too busy to test portions of this. Would you like, give us, you guys give us the parameters and run them by your auditors. We'll test by your script. Here you go. Looks good. What do you think? When do you want to see us again?" Kind of thing. So there's a little bit of everything. We don't see it as a huge thing, but we're pretty flexible. So a lot of different scenarios with it.
No, it's good. I mean, what it does is it does open up the conversation to everything
Yeah,
else that we're
yeah,
offering, right?
sure. Yeah.
So Roy, real quick, just gave us a quick story. He says, "I experienced 2 firsthand disasters. Right, one flood, took everything out, power communication, data center out of commission. 2 weeks to come back from the dead. And then being a government, it was able to continue operations sequentially, right? So that looks like it was like a government, some sort of government agency. And then the second one was a financial institution where they experienced a fire, so they shut down the data center, the fire shut down the data center, and then they had supposed to have a duplicate system in another city for geo redundancy, but the 2 systems were not compatible for whatever reason. Business never survived. Business never came back from it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is the type of stuff that you uncover when you try to offer this as a formal service, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
It's also on the context of, look, how many MSPs through the years MSPs have been taught with peer groups and stuff to become the trusted advisor, right? To endeavor to be more than the technology person. And a lot of that messaging now coming out of post COVID is like, hey, the client is listening. That's why business continuity planning is, they're listening, right? They're listening to you as the advisor, get closer to the table and get that big seat at the table now, right? And unless you have a really deep maturity to your business model, that's a difficult sell when you're going in and you're going, okay, pre-COVID and pre this type of attention that we're getting, I'm talking about backups and I'm talking about cybersecurity. Okay, well, no, post-COVID, I'm going to talk about backups and I'm going to talk about cybersecurity, right? So what business continuity planning really allows you to do is, one, you're changing the conversation. There's a big MRR opportunity that doesn't exist, but most importantly is, as Dan would attest to, when you start talking to them about all the continuity and all those different scenarios, you're learning about their whole business, not just the technology.
Yep.
And that's the big difference, right? And that's a very big driver here.
No, it's a very good point. And frankly, the more that you get into somebody's world, it's a lot deeper than the surface level that I think a lot of people do with just, hey, you only talk to the owner who signs the checks, or you only talk to the office manager who made the pitch to management. Like, you don't know about everything else until you're in it. And at that point, it may take a long time, years, in order to really figure out every nook and cranny of these people, because they just don't know until you ask and drag the information out of them. So, Troy, how do people get to you?
Well, you can just reach us at partners@cloudoakchannel.com, cloudoakchannel.com. And, it is something that's very new. Like Dan is the reason, you can tell, has a tremendous amount of experience, progressive in looking at those types of opportunities, and understands kind of, what something like business continuity planning represents. So only thing I would encourage a lot of MSPs to do on this is to start thinking a little bit differently around that opportunity, because a lot of guys, you look at now, when they say the client is listening, this is the perfect time. Like, it's a perfect time. And I don't mean that in trying to exploit a really bad situation, but as McLevanian quote, right? Never let a good crisis go to waste. This is that time.
Oh, the people who have used that quote recently. Dan and Troy, I really appreciate you guys from coming on to the MSP Initiative for this week. For anyone that doesn't know, we run MSP Initiative Tuesdays and Thursdays, or at least we have been so far. We're going to continue doing it, and just trying to bring more information to the table, right? I mean, there's a lot of aspects that people haven't really thought about, and this one was, fit the bill perfectly. So I appreciate you gentlemen for taking a little bit of time, and for everyone taking an hour out of your day to come and actually, maybe learn a few things. And we hope to see you again on Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Good luck, guys. Have a good day.
Bye. You
Okay,
too.
you too.